Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks for the big turnout. This is great. Let me just first thank our sponsors, which is the Center for a Legal Profession at Stanford and the Criminal Justice Center, for hosting this great event that I think is going to be very interesting. So I'm Emily, I'm friends. I've known Emily for almost 10 years now.
We're checking to see if it was okay to say we were friends.
Publicly, yeah, exactly, yeah. I genuinely think that she has not only one of the most interesting jobs in American law, but maybe one of the most important. She is a staff writer for the New York Times Magazine. She teaches at Yale Law School, and she is a co-host of the Slate Political Gabfest. And that's a nice resume, but here's why I think that her job is so important. First of all, there's few, if any, people in the country, really, who have the stage and audience that she has, with the ability to write long form about complicated legal issues and digest, serious controversies and issues that are going on in the law, and then translate it to such a wide audience. Second, she has written some really tremendously important stories, breaking news, in sex trafficking, in cyber crimes among children, abortion, criminal justice, the Supreme Court. And third, I think that she helps shapes the law in ways that few other lawyers really can. Because she's so well-read and respected, judges read what she writes, lawyers read what she writes, legislators read what she writes, and I really do think that that has a long-term influence on the direction of law in America. And her book that I think is going to be the centerpiece of our conversation today is a perfect example. In the book, she dissects what is obviously an issue that's near and dear to my heart, but one of the most complicated problems in American justice today, and sorts through what I think is interesting and counterintuitive in some ways, and in some ways controversial solution that obviously that she'll talk about, but I think holds promise for real change. So Emily, thank you for coming all the way out to California.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And then I also want to introduce Matt Gonzalez to her right. Matt first came across my radar when he was running for mayor. Were you a Green candidate then? That's right. He was as a Green candidate for mayor and barely lost to the corporate conservative candidate that is now the governor of California. But he was also the president of the Board of Supervisors for City of San Francisco. He was responsible for important things like bringing a minimum wage to California. He also, I think interestingly for this conversation, ran for DA of San Francisco 20 years ago before he ran for mayor. Not incidentally, he was also Ralph Nader's vice presidential candidate in 2008 when for.
I've lost a lot of races.
Yes, you've lost.
Board of Supervisors.
Yeah, but
that one he won.
Yes, but he now. So he now holds. I didn't mean to. I'm sorry to bring it up. These are backhanded compliments, I guess. But now he is the lead supervising attorney at the district attorney's office. At the public defender's office in San Francisco, and under his leadership and under the leadership of the late Jeff Adachi, the public defender in San Francisco, I think, has really stood out around the country as being one of the most innovative, creative, and aggressive public defenders in the country, not only in their direct representation of individuals charged with crimes in San Francisco, obviously, but also taking on important impact issues and policy issues, from bail reform in California, that came out of his office, to abuses within the jails and prison systems, that's also come out of his office. And so he's really led a spectacularly interesting career, and I should not neglect to mention that he was, of course, a graduate of this fine law school. And then finally, and I'm about to hand it over to David, who really needs no introduction, as one of our best and favorite professors here at the school. So anyway, with that, please welcome our group.
I think I don't need. Thank you both for coming.
It's wonderful to welcome both of you back, and it's wonderful to have both of you here for this same event. Emily, if we can start with you, can you talk about why you wanted to write a book about prosecutors, and if you were surprised by anything you found while researching it? Do you need this?
No, I have my own mic. Yes, I just want to start by saying thank you to David and to Deborah Rohde for bringing me here. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you so much for coming. So I have actually been telling this story all over the country, but it is a perfect story for this group. So I started thinking about the power of prosecutors in 2010 when I was writing about a ballot initiative to reform the 3 strikes law in California. The person who put me onto that story was Mike Romano, who was working on that ballot initiative. And at the time, it had some surprising support from Steve Cooley, who was the conservative Republican district attorney in Los Angeles. Kind of footnote here, it did not have support from Kamala Harris, who at the time was the DA in San Francisco. But that's not why I'm telling you the story. So I was on the phone with Steve Cooley, trying to understand why, given his ideological background and political preferences, he was in favor of and supporting this ballot initiative. And he told me a story from his early days as a prosecutor. So this is back in the 90s. There was a man named Gregory Taylor, whose case came into the LA District Attorney's Office. Gregory Taylor was homeless, and his offense was that he had unscrewed the screws on a screen door of a food pantry at a church to get inside because he was hungry, and the food pantry was closed. And this case file landed not on Steve Cooley's desk, but on the desk of the prosecutor next to Cooley. And that prosecutor charged this offense as a 3rd strike. So Gregory Taylor got a life sentence. And Steve Cooley told me this story to say, this is why I think that this law is excessive and need to be curbed. I think it goes too far. I heard that story and thought, wait a second. So the fact that this man's case file landed on one prosecutor's desk instead of the other made this enormous difference, basically determined the course of the rest of his life. I had just never thought about that idea before. But once I noticed it, I started seeing it over and over again as a reporter when I was writing about criminal justice issues. And then after I proposed this book, sort of to my surprise, a movement grew up around the country to change the way prosecutors use their power and to elect prosecutors who were interested in harnessing their power, not to put people in prison for longer times, but instead to try to reduce incarceration and increase fairness. And so as that movement sprang up, that is the thing that surprised me. From my point of view, it came about not exactly out of nowhere, but it started with a really small group of people, and then it kind of spread throughout the country because local groups, often coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement, realized that this office of DA was one that they could rise up and take over without that many votes. It was actually like doable. And a tangible gain they could bring to their communities. So that was the thing that both surprised me and also the story I got the most interested in telling. Partly because journalists love change, right? It meant that this picture that had been static for decades of prosecutors almost entirely using their power to be tough on crime, it means that that story is changing.
So the title of this program is, Are Prosecutors the Key to Criminal Justice Reform? So let me ask you, are prosecutors the key to criminal justice reform?
So prosecutors are a second best solution. Like if I was waving a magic wand, I would start with state sentencing laws. I'd repeal mandatory minimum sentences, which shifted so much discretion to prosecutors and also generally just ramped up punishment. That would be like the clean fix. You would persuade a lot of state legislators that they went too far, that having more than 2 million people in prison is not necessary to prevent crime. It's doing a tremendous amount of harm. It costs taxpayers gazillion dollars. They would all kind of get religion about that and deal with the law that way. I don't see that happening quickly or easily. I think state legislatures are a heavier lift than local DA offices for the reasons we were just talking about, that the power of local voters has turned out to be easier to access in various cities and metropolitan areas. So in our current political world, I think that prosecutors are a key to criminal justice reform. We're going to see how much they're really able and interested in unlocking these doors to jail and prison and changing and shrinking the system. But I think right now they're the best option that I see in a kind of pragmatic sense that actually is taking place out there in the world.
Do you agree with that, Matt?
Well, I think from my own experience, mostly from the vantage point of the defense, we have mostly not had an offense except for trying to tell stories in the press that you're now telling. I think the key is probably legislative, and I'll give you one example. One of the things that's bothered me the most about the criminal justice system is that defendants are placed in a position where they're offered a great plea bargain. They're professing their, innocence, but they also see that if they pass up this deal, that they could spend the rest of their life in prison. And I've literally seen in life in prison cases offers for probation that when they get turned down result in a month-long trial and either convictions or acquittals. And so I think like a legislative solution would be to say that if a prosecutor offers somebody a certain number of years in a case and it gets turned down after their trial, there should be a limit of, let's say, 2 times whatever that offer was. So if it's a life in prison case, you get offered 3 years, you turn it down, you go to trial, you lose, the maximum you should get is 6, not life. Things like that. I mean, if we can come up with creative, and maybe that's not a good one, but I like it. And I just think that it would be great to try to just put more shackles on what is a very powerful position.
So it strikes me that you're talking about things that would reduce the power of prosecutors. And Emily, you said what initially drew you into this was the enormous power that prosecutors and line prosecutors often have. But my impression is that the progressive prosecutors movement isn't really aiming to reduce the power of prosecutors. It's mostly about saying, well, we have popularly elected district attorneys, so let's use the power in a sensible way. Is there a tension there?
Yes, there's definitely a tension there. So I think you're right. I think, when you get elected into office, the first thing you do is not generally to say, and now let me recede and give away all this authority I've been handed. And I think this is a real live issue in the movement. The sort of optimistic spin on it is that prosecutors will first harness their power to reduce incarceration, make things better, and then they'll give up some of their power. I don't know whether that second part is really going to happen. I mean, the jury's still out on the first part, truly. I do think there are some ways in which progressive prosecutors can give up their power. So let's go back to plea bargaining, which Matt was just talking about, which is such a huge issue. Maybe you all know this, but more than 95% of convictions are obtained through plea bargains now in state court. The trial is something that happens mostly on television and partly in my book, but not in the real world very much. And one thing that prosecutors can do is set the kinds of limits Matt was just talking about on themselves. So you were talking about reducing what's called the trial penalty, where if you take the plea bargain, you get a short sentence, you roll the dice and go to trial. Well, you just made the prosecutor, the whole system, do a lot of work. They don't want to do that work. And so then they're going to really make you pay for it on the other end in this very heavy way. Prosecutors could themselves announce tomorrow, we're not going to have trial penalties of the magnitude that we've had in the past. I haven't really seen that happen yet. That would be giving up a lot of leverage. I think another thing that progressive prosecutors can do, and that it's crucial for them to do, is to become a kind of countervailing lobbying force to the traditional state and national DAs associations, which always ask for heavier sentences, tough on crime, more power. That's their unrelenting stance. And so to the extent that folks like Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, that's where I grew up, my sister works for Krasner, so I'm watching that office with interest, he quit his state DA's association a couple months ago, just said, I don't like what you guys are doing. And, oh, hey, by the way, I'm 1/3 of your budget because Philadelphia is such a big city in Pennsylvania, and I'm taking that money with me. So that's a way in which I think prosecutors can start lobbying for less prosecutorial power overall, even if they're going to be reluctant to do that in their own offices.
So let me ask you a question I get asked by reporters sometimes. Somebody will be up for re-election. It could be Larry Krasner. Could be Kamala Harris running for a new office. And people say, well, was she really a progressive prosecutor, or was he really a progressive prosecutor? He didn't do anything to reduce his power. He didn't do anything to reduce the sentencing discounts. Kamala Harris didn't do anything to address bail reform. So how do you think voters should decide when a prosecutor who purports to be progressive is up for re-election, whether in fact he or she really has earned that title?
I think at this point in time, the bar is pretty high and that it should be high. And that mostly the answer to this question has to do with the local groups who fought really hard to elect these folks. So they have their own yardsticks. They often start with reducing the number of people in jail and prison. Bail reform is huge because so many people are induced to plead guilty because they're being detained pre-trial, and going to jail even for a short time wrecks people's lives. So there are various yardsticks that you can actually look at the statistics. Racial disparity is another one. My book actually ends with an appendix that has 21 of these ideas in them, and part of the reason I put that set of principles together was to give local voters a possible checklist. Okay, my prosecutor, is he or she doing these things? If I value these things, what does that translate in terms of how I support? So I think the standard should be high, that it's mostly, that this question of accountability is mostly up to local communities. Criminal justice is a national concern in America, but it is completely, almost completely a matter of local and state power. This is one area in which Washington has almost nothing to do with it because the federal prison system is such a small fraction of the whole. And so you really can have a lot of variation in how prosecutors act, and I think a different sense of what's possible in a place like San Francisco than in, for example, Jacksonville, Florida, where there is a reformer in office, Melissa Nelson. She's a Republican. She's not going to do exactly what Larry Krasner's doing, but she inherited a system with terrible racial disparity in the death penalty, in juvenile justice. And so, her voters are going to look at her to address those things.
So, Matt, we're going to have a new district attorney in San Francisco. We don't know who it's going to be, but odds are this person is going to be running for re-election at some point. Now's maybe a good time before the new person takes office, we don't know who it is, to think about how we want to assess that person's performance. What would you want to see from a district attorney so that you could say, when that person is running for re-election, the first term was a success?
I think the current district attorney, George Cascone, kind of offers a template to a certain extent for someone that has achieved a lot of very positive things. He's gone out and helped change the three-strike law and promoted some of the not only realignment in the state, but some of the measures that lowered, felonies down to misdemeanors. He's done a lot of very progressive things. But he runs into one problem, which was he didn't prosecute enough or any police officers in a variety of shootings that have happened in San Francisco. And so the left has been extremely critical of him. To his credit, he's been out there arguing that these are really state legislative changes about the standard that a police officer is held to when they use deadly force against somebody. And, we're talking about a 19th century law that does not really exist in other states that makes it very hard to prosecute police. But for that, the template would be, here's someone going out there pushing for reform statewide so it affects more conservative counties, not just San Francisco. Locally, he's promoting the expansion of what we call the specialty courts of, any kind of alternative to incarceration. So he would score quite well. And I would say for the next district attorney, it would be a very similar measuring point. For Kamala Harris, for those that came before, I guess from a personal level, I'm not really that concerned about whether or not these former prosecutors have a political career beyond that post. It kind of feels like, if we're not really excited by what they did as a district attorney, I'm not really want to spend a lot of time worrying about whether or not they make it to the Senate or elsewhere.
Yeah. So you mentioned prosecution of police officers, and a lot of what people who ask for progressive prosecutors ask for is that they will do less harm. It's like the Florence Nightingale principle. But it is true that lots of people want prosecutors to do some stuff too. Lots of people want prosecutors to prosecute police officers who've committed crime. Lots of people want prosecutors to prosecute other people who've committed crimes. And what prosecutors will sometimes say is, we're sort of caught between a rock and a hard place. Yes, it's true where people want us to be fair-minded, but we have to go into court. We have to battle against defense attorneys. It's hard to get convictions, and that's part of what we're supposed to be doing. So I guess my question is, when voters are assessing a prosecutor who's running for re-election, is that part of the calculus too, how effective they've been at securing convictions of people who should be convicted?
Sure, and then the question is, what do you mean by should be convicted, and what are we, are you talking about pure conviction rate numbers, which,
I'm the moderator.
So I would argue against...
I was going to say no, by the way. So.
Yeah.
I would argue against using conviction rates overall as the tool of assessing a prosecutor's performance, because I think it has gotten us straight toward mass incarceration. I would also avoid judging prosecutors based on one or two high-profile cases of whatever nature, because I think we do that way too often, and usually those big headline cases, again, have been about fear-mongering and have led us toward harsher punishments, not more lenience. And so that's why I was talking about these other kinds of statistical yardsticks, or we can think about, the pretrial detention rate and the state prison numbers overall and racial disparity. Those seem like better measures to me. I think another thing you can look at is community satisfaction, right? So, victims are such an important part of this conversation, and centering them in it is crucial, but also being more imaginative about how to serve victims. Any survey of victims in this country, they tell you how dissatisfied and betrayed they feel by our system. It is not working for them. And so when people invoke victims to kind of prop up the existing system, that is not really an accurate depiction of their response to the system. So I think that's another sort of piece of this here.
So if a district attorney wanted to be more responsive to the real concerns of victims, what do you think she would do?
I think you'd have a lot more restorative justice practices, frankly. I mean, restorative justice, and what I mean by that is alternatives to jail and prison and other forms of punishment in which you bring people who've been harmed together with the people who've harmed them, and you have some kind of real reckoning. And sometimes that leads to restitution. It can also mean apologies, but there's some kind of deeper human interaction that takes place. That is something that's been pretty fringy in our system so far. It's around the edges. There's a great program in the Oakland School District, or a small but really interesting program in Brooklyn. It's not something that is in every single system that is generally an option in especially felony cases. And yet, there are examples of it being very powerful in a lot of places and victims responding well to it.
So Darcel Clark, I'm sorry, Matt, why don't you?
Well, I was just going to say, I love restorative justice, and I think one of the things about the system that, despite the fact that the narrative is often how people feel about the system, and the most affected, let's say personally in terms of injury, are the victims. But the district attorney very rarely talks to victims. Because of the law that was passed in the early 90s, Prop 115, that allows hearsay evidence at a preliminary hearing, you don't even have victims often testifying in a heavy case at a preliminary hearing. And the DA's handling cases at that level are often, they're not super experienced. And so you have all these cases settling with nobody talking to the victims. You've got cases on the eve of going to trial, and the attorneys don't really know how the alleged victims are going to perform in trial or whether or not, their story's going to hold up. And so there are all these places, I think, that, if you were going to measure how a district attorney is doing, that satisfaction and the ability to get the parties really talking to one another can make a big difference. The thing I'll add to it is I've often been shocked doing this work for nearly 30 years at how rarely the folks in court have, how rare it is for them to hear the defendant's voice ever. If the defendant doesn't give a statement to the police, it's very likely that nobody will ever hear his voice except as a defense attorney. So you go into court, the judge is looking down, let's call line whatever. The defendant steps out. Maybe he'll say yes or no to whether or not he wants to waive a right to a speedy trial. But a better system would be one where a defendant talked about what had happened from their point of view, and we could impose controls that wouldn't allow certain pretrial statements to be used at a later time, like what we have in settlement discussions in civil cases. Because before I go see a client and I read a police report, I'm thinking like, whoa, this is a
One
rough
bad
case.
dude.
Yeah. Then I go sit down, I'm like, oh my God, this guy is great, I would have him to my house and, be friends with him, et cetera. And it's like everything changes, everything shifts, but the other parties, the DA, who spent their whole career prosecuting people without talking to defendants and judges, they don't get to see that part of it.
Can I pick up on that? So this is my job as a reporter, is to tell people stories and to try to get you and prosecutors and anyone to think through that lens. And so one of the things I've been doing since my book came out a few weeks ago has been talking to different DA's offices around the country. And I've been really struck when the prosecutors have read my book before I showed up, that just thinking through, looking at the case through the eyes of someone who's affected by the system kind of shifts their perception a little bit. And, one of my main messages has been like, figure out some way to talk to these folks. I do think it's important to say that increasingly in our country, victims and perpetrators of violence overlap. We're talking about the same communities. And so in that sense, if assistant DAs talk to victims, they're at least talking to people who are from similar neighborhoods and backgrounds, but they're not talking to them when they're situated in the same way. And so that shift in perspective, I think, is really missing, like you were saying.
So particularly since Matt's here, I'd like to talk a little bit about how defense attorneys fit into this picture. Because Darcel Clark, who is the district attorney in the Bronx, likes to say, our office needs to represent the entire community. Not just victims, not just the families of victims, but defendants and the families of defendants as well. But a lot of prosecutors say there's somebody else who's supposed to be representing the defendant. That's the defense attorney. It's not my job to be looking out for the defendant. So I don't find, that feels like something of a cop-out to me. On the other hand, I do wonder sometimes whether all the attention to progressive prosecutors has diverted some needed attention from the problem of inadequate funding, inadequate resourcing of indigent defense. So I guess I just would like to ask both of you how the role of the defense attorney affects what you think about the job of a prosecutor should be, and also what you think criminal justice reformers should be paying attention to.
Well, I certainly agree that in many jurisdictions, the issue of resources is such a key component of it. I know there's efforts to try to get funding or to take funding for public defenders and make it into a federal allotment or mandate, and I like the sound of that. Certainly for the jurisdictions that don't have a more robust public defender office. In San Francisco, we've succeeded in playing a part in criminal justice reform, mostly by going to the media and trying to promote not just transgressions by police and prosecutors, but we've been able to, or willing to fight judges, et cetera. But I think that public defenders, more than anything, we're sort of like, on a daily basis, we engage in this like currency exchange. What is something worth? It's kind of like if, I grew up on the Texas-Mexican border, and, like the peso and the dollar, it fluctuates daily. And there's something like that happens in the courthouse. And over the years, I've seen that shift quite dramatically. And it's shifted in part because defense lawyers have refused to just go along with something, and they're willing to try to talk their clients into understanding what the currency exchange actually should be. In other cases, it's simply because a generation of people got injured by having really heavy sentences imposed on them. And it got so bad that at some point, even prosecutors and judges wouldn't do it anymore because they had just hurt so many people that even they wouldn't go there anymore. And that took a long time, and a lot of people have suffered. But I don't know if that's really answering it. I mean, I think I don't think defense lawyers are in a fundamentally an vantage point of strength in the system. I think we're reacting, and at least to the extent that in San Francisco there's an elected public defender and a willingness to do things that won't be done anywhere else. We have a fellow from the University of Michigan, a graduate he's an attorney, and he received some kind of yearly fellowship. And the fellowship is to work on prosecutorial misconduct. And he went around looking for offices, public defender offices, where he might work. Nobody would take him except San Francisco. Everybody kept saying, you should talk to the San Francisco guys. They might let you do this. And of course, he's in our office. We've let him publish attacks on, prosecutors and all kinds of things. But that's a part of it too. If you can create that independence of an elected position, maybe there's more power.
So, when you look across the country at the variation in defense for poor people, whether states have a centralized system, which is usually better, how much they pay for it, what kinds of attorneys are appointed when the public defender, if there even is one, can't take a case, it's one of the most shameful parts of our system. Maybe one of the things that the country should be the most ashamed about is just incredibly variable and terrible in many places. So absolutely, it should get more attention, and I also like the idea of having a kind of federal national standard and funding for it. I think that this progressive prosecutor movement has been really frustrating for a lot of public defenders. I think San Francisco is a little special in the ways you were just pointing to. Like, you're not afraid to have someone working on prosecutorial accountability in your office. A lot of public defenders wouldn't want to touch that with the 10-foot pole because the prosecutors are the people they're appealing to constantly for their clients, and they're afraid to alienate them. I was in Seattle last week, and the public defender's office asked me to come and speak. And then they gave me this proposal they were working on in which they were trying to essentially change plea bargaining for teenagers, for juveniles, the way that Matt was just describing. It was like a little more technical, but they were trying to address this problem. And the whole proposal was framed as an appeal to the district attorney, who's a pretty progressive guy, but he'd been ignoring them for months. And I just thought, like, God, this would just be rough to be the appointed public defender in Seattle and feel like you were sort of begging for crumbs from this DA, and it was really up to the DA whether to pay attention to you or not. So I think that in a lot of places, recognizing that the power lies in the DA's office is also a problem for thinking from the point of view of public defenders. I mean, public defenders are and defense lawyers are so important in terms of protecting their clients' rights and all the things they do in court. They're in a difficult position to make more systemic change right now, and I think that's just like a tough part of this that I haven't fully grappled with.
So why isn't that near the top of the list then of what we should want from a progressive prosecutor? Why shouldn't we say if you want to be a progressive prosecutor, one of the most important things you need to do is to advocate for better funding and resourcing of indigent defense?
I think it can be. One of the problems is that in the cities that tend to have progressive prosecutors, indigent defense is looking okay. So it's just not the places that are the worst in this regard are not the places that are electing these kinds of DAs.
So one question that students here often ask is, given the changing landscape of criminal justice reform, if I really care about making criminal justice better, should I be a prosecutor or should I be a defense attorney? What advice would you give to students who ask that kind of question?
Well, I would never talk somebody out of choosing a prosecutor's path. I think the dilemma for someone who makes that choice, though, is that there's no question that you have more power and that you can achieve more. But the question is sort of like, who's going to teach you how to do it right? And so there's probably a solid, it's like getting tenure, a solid 7, 8, 9 years where you're going to have to build the experience to then really be the prosecutor that you envision, right now. And I'm not sure how that happens in these institutional places that aren't progressive.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it matters a great deal what office you would go work in. I also think there are some people, like, they want to be on Matt's side of this world. They want to be fighting to spare someone punishment, not thinking about how to do punishment more fairly. And that's, like, completely legitimate and really important. And if you want to wear that hat, like, go wear that hat. I've been watching, I mentioned my sister Dana earlier, who works for Larry Krasner. So Dana was a Philadelphia public defender and then, a court-appointed defense lawyer and civil rights lawyer in Philadelphia. And when she first she worked on Krasner's campaign and then decided to go inside. And then, the first day in office, she had this, this ID from their ID card from the Philly DA's office, and she texted it to me like, I can't believe this. It was a real shift in mindset for her. I think what has made her come around to it is the power that Matt was talking about. So she can also text me and say, like, I designed this new system for trying to deal with what in Philadelphia, it's very specific, but they have this detainer process. So if you violate your parole, you go right to jail, and you don't even get a hearing for a couple weeks until your judge and your case can see you. It's just this, like, a lot of locking people up for basically, because they missed their curfew or whatever. And so she designed a system to have the hearings happen in 24 or 48 hours. And so now she can say, like, 68 people got out of jail this week because, like, I was sitting there running these lists. That is a satisfying moment to have. And so I think that's the kind of trade-off here.
So I do want to give people in the audience time to ask questions, but before we do that, if we can end on maybe a more hopeful note. So you've talked about some promising stuff that's happening in Philadelphia. Where else do you see promising things happen, and can you talk about some of those?
Yeah, I mean, I see promising things happening, like, sprouting up all over the country. It's not to say that we're, like, anywhere near where we need to go. But if you think about the way people are talking about criminal justice, that is changing. So my book is a lot about the DA in Brooklyn, Eric Gonzalez, who is a career prosecutor, also the first Puerto Rican DA in New York, someone who grew up on the streets of Brooklyn, like, really in the same neighborhood as people he then started prosecuting. I have a podcast that's like a 6-episode miniseries that's called Charge, like my book. And the episode that dropped last week is all about Eric Gonzalez's story. Like, his brother was killed by a drug dealer. He really comes from that world in a way that's unusual for a DA. And he's talked a lot about jail and prison being a last resort and expanding diversion programs and declining to prosecute a lot of low-level offenses that are not best dealt with in criminal court. So I think Brooklyn, like San Francisco, has some history of being more interested in progressive steps. That's one place. I also think you can go look in an unlikely place like Texas, where the Dallas DA, whose name is John Creuzot, he just announced that there were a bunch of low-level offenses he wasn't going to prosecute. The police got really mad, called on him to resign. He was undeterred. St. Louis, Wesley Bell, elected out of the tremendous distress about Michael Brown's death and the inequities in the Ferguson system. He ended cash bail effectively pretty much in St. Louis, and that pretrial jail population is down 12%. So I think there are a bunch of places where things are really happening, and I also always, at this moment, want to give a shout out to the state of New Jersey. Nobody wants to be like the state of New Jersey. That's like, but honestly, we all should. They have a really distinct structure there. This is very wonky, but it's important, and you guys are a law school audience, so I'm just going to go with it. They have a centralized statewide prosecution office, centralized statewide public defender, centralized courts. Nobody's elected, so everybody is a little bit insulated from the political process. And a few years ago, they passed this criminal justice reform bill. It had bail reform and speedy trial in it, so kind of going from both ends of the system. And Chris Christie, former federal prosecutor, then the Republican governor in New Jersey, he signed this bill. They put it into effect. Their pretrial jail population is down more than 40%. And that's statewide. And they got rid of the whole bail industry. People outside of California tend to be very nervous about your bail reform bill, at least on the left. This is an alternative that looks to me like it's more functional.
I was born in Trenton, and what people say there is Trenton makes, the world takes.
Yes, there used to be like you would ride by on Amtrak and you could see that. I always thought it was a little odd, but I'm from Philadelphia, so I basically am from New Jersey.
So Matt, where do you see basis for hope about criminal justice reform?
Well, I ran for, I was saying earlier, for district attorney in 1999, and it was really before, the Black Lives Movement and all the technology of body-worn camera and even public cameras. And back then, when you tried cases and you were up against the police, you had to really, it was just harder because we didn't, you couldn't prove it decisively. And it was old school witnesses and cross-examination. But at that time, I was talking about a lot of things that I didn't, I guess I didn't think about it, but I didn't really think they would come to pass. One of them, for instance, I remember on the campaign trail, I was talking about things like how when police officers get accused of maybe, let's say, killing somebody on the line of duty or what have you, that the DA would typically take that case to the grand jury to bury the case there because they could always soft pedal it to a grand jury, and then, when the grand jury didn't bring back an indictment, they could get in front of the cameras and say, well, we gave it to the grand jury, they decided not to prosecute. And I remember being out there saying, how unfair it was and how it was just whatever, you get the point. But a couple of years ago, the California legislature basically took away the right to take those cases to a grand jury. I mean, even that reform, which is huge, I never believed I would see in my lifetime. And the way juries look today, so much more diversity. And as I mentioned, these judges who 20 years ago would give the maximum sentence in any case that you lost. I mean, I remember trying a felony case. The first felony I ever tried, the exposure was 6 years. It was an attempted robbery case with resisting arrest and a knife possession or something. And before the judge had heard anything about it, the judge was already telling me that my client was going to get maxed out if we lost. And I remember saying, you haven't even heard a single witness yet. Like, how could you say this? That's totally different now. There isn't, at least in San Francisco, there isn't a trial tax like there used to be. And so these do give some optimism, although it's taken, 2.5 decades or 3 decades, at least for me to see it. I do accept that things are improving.
So you've all been very patient. I want to give you a chance to ask questions. Now, I'd like to start with students. So if there are students here who have questions, yes. Yeah.
So I'm actually from New Jersey. Very happy to be
Excellent.
I did work in Trenton last summer, so I saw it. They basically said that. I'm really interested in the messaging of this issue. So I'm particularly curious to hear, Emily, if you see when you go around and you talk to people, if you see people on the left and people on the right sort of being equally sort of moving away from this sort of tough on crime type rhetoric, and whether people on the left and people on the right are sort of becoming less receptive to it symmetrically, or if it really tends to resonate more with one group than another, especially considering like the racial implications of this whole
I don't think it's symmetrical in this sense. I think people on the left are more galvanized by this. I think there are a lot of conservatives who are like really willing to go pretty far toward reducing mass incarceration. I just don't think they're as likely to like lift up this issue and make a big deal of it. And there's also some continuing attachment, not especially evidence-based, to the notion that, oh, come on, the reason that crime has dropped so much, it's because prison works. So I think that's there is bipartisan support. And from my point of view, that's really important to emphasize because I think it helps bring more people on board. And to conservatives, there's such a good fiscally conservative argument to make about the cost of the system and all the resources we're wasting and like what's the return on investment to jail and prison when 2/3 of people cycle back in. And this concept of jail and prison as being criminogenic, as actually causing more crime, not in the immediate term when you have people locked up, but afterward when they leave, because almost all of them leave. That concept I see, having this bipartisan appeal. I do think, though, when you look at like the heavy lifting energy behind this, it's still more on the left. And then you have groups like the Koch brothers, which are invested to some degree, and also, I think, enjoying the relatively positive mainstream press coverage that they're getting from attaching themselves to the movement.
Matt, as an off-and-on political candidate, do you want to address that one?
Well, I was trying to think if I thought conservatives were supporting criminal justice reform, and I can't say that I have an entryway into answering that. I don't know that I've really seen that.
Other questions from students? Yes.
Most of the reforms have been focused on nonviolent offenders and leaving out many of the violent offenders. And the label of violent offender is very, very broad and encompasses many charges. What officers are doing a good job of attacking more of the mass incarceration policies around what they consider violent offenders?
So you are totally singing my song. This is such an important point to bring up. So more than half the people in jail and prison in this country are there for what we call violent crimes. That includes things like gun possession in New York or breaking and entering into an empty house that are not acts of actual violence or serious violence, but we've termed them that way. And once you call someone a violent offender, it's much harder politically to take a bet on them. So my book tells a story of a diversion program in Brooklyn that's for gun offenders that does take this risk at significant, with significant resistance from the police and even from Mayor Bill de Blasio, who's a liberal Democrat in New York. So it's an uphill battle, but the diversion program that I write a lot about is one that has a really good record in terms of lowering the rate of reoffending. And when this is part of why I told the stories I told in my book, but when you look at Kevin, who's the main character in my book and had this illegal gun and then was convicted as a serious violent felony offender, the reasons that it's not good that he had a gun, I don't want to excuse that. Guns are dangerous. But the reasons in his life that he had a gun, it's really hard to see how sending him to prison is going to address what's wrong or make his community safer. And so I think that in Brooklyn, the DA's office has recognized that and has been willing to take a bet on some of these younger gun offenders or people who commit burglary or even robbery. And that's really unusual. But if we're really going to have this movement take off and, half or more the number of people we have locked up, that has to happen next. It makes sense that it's not the starting point, but it also is true that these harder cases are one that are increasingly crucial for us to grapple with.
So Matt, in some ways you have a particularly good perspective on this, since 2 years ago you represented somebody who was charged with murder and wound up being convicted just of being a felon in possession of a firearm. Somebody who was pilloried by people across the country, including the President of the United States. So I'm wondering how you feel, how good a job you think this DA's office, the DA's office in San Francisco, has done at making people accused of violent crime part of the reform agenda too.
Well, I like George Cascone quite a bit. I think he is the most progressive district attorney San Francisco's ever had. We have our differences. And I think to the last question that was asked, it is really challenging to sort out what to do with the violent cases, because on the one hand, you can just look at the result in a particular case where there is actual physical violence versus the ones that could lead to that, right? You're always going to fit even a purse snatching or the residential burglary within the context of something that could get out of hand. I don't think we're going to see the ultimate reform until we let go of actual physical violence occurring. This is going to be hard to explain, and maybe I'm not that articulate right now, but it seems to me that, a lot of fights where somebody might pull a gun out or might pull a knife out, you could have 100 of those, and maybe only one of them is going to result in physical harm to someone. And sometimes that's going to happen because of some fact that isn't even relevant to the two major parties. It might be a third person walks out and sees it and acts in a way that causes more violence or more action. It's very hard for us to get into a mindset to let go of the outcome in that case when we try to put together a resolution of what we think would be fair and best for everybody, society included. We're so attached to the physical injury and the outcome. And I don't know how we're going to get there, but I think it's going to be a process to do that. I'm not really answering your question, but at least what I've seen on a local level, we have to legislate away from certain tools that prosecutors have if we're really going to keep them from using them. Because even a great district attorney or a progressive one can't police every case that's winding its way through the system. And we still see cases, although not super recently, but let's say 3-4 years ago, where somebody on some little hand-to-hand sale with priors gets over a decade in jail in a good prosecutor's office, where you just feel like this is the last person to die in this, this antiquated war. So they still sneak through. But if you legislate and take away the 3-year priors that you can attach, or you take away the felony murder rule, and you create these other things, then DAs don't even go there because they don't miss the tool. But if you give them the tool, they go there.
John, did you have your hand up?
Yes. Thanks a lot for coming here. I really enjoyed reading the book. So my question is about bringing a culture change in the DA's office. So in one of the chapters you wrote, Larry Krasner, when he first took over the office, he sent out an email to the fellow saying that if you don't like a new idea, here's the door. So I think a lot of the prosecutors, the progressive prosecutors, like what I think of as Kimog. So what they did is firing a bunch of supervising prosecutors, and then they said that I'm going to lead a new team. But for most of us, we think that it's just impossible to replace the entire office. So you're left with a bunch of old dogs. So now what they have to do is to teach the old dog the new tricks. Is that possible, or what we have is just like you have to fire people?
Yeah, Kimog, we should say Kimog is the district attorney in Harris County, Texas.
Houston, essentially. And she did fire, she and Krasner both fired over 30 people, and then a bunch of other people walked out the door. So, look, like, when people take over corporations, they fire, generally, like, the leadership team leaves. Like, that seems to me like a perfectly acceptable route to change, that you come in, you're essentially trying to remake your office. You don't necessarily need to have exactly the same people there who were there when you walked in the door. I think the main thing that I see happening nationally is this: whether you bring in whether you replace the kind of supervising, the sort of executive team or not, you have a couple more layers in a big DA's office. You have the actual line prosecutors, who can be you guys like a year or two from now, and then you have supervisors. And the supervisor ranks, it's really hard to come in and just get rid of all of those people in a big office. There are just like a lot of them. And they can really be a kind of impediment to change, even if the top is decreeing change and the ADAs from the bottom really want change, they can run into resistance in a kind of everyday way. And so those are the folks where the cultural change is the most crucial. And I think that some of them, yes, like you can teach old dogs new tricks. If you give people different incentives to be rewarded and promoted, and they decide to stay in an office that has this different set of goals, like they can decide to do their jobs differently. But it's hard. It doesn't happen right away. And part of the reason it's hard is this kind of deep, profound question, which I think is this, like, none of us as professionals want to think that, like, we were doing our job and doing harm for all those years, right? Like, if I, as a journalist, thought, like, I spent the last 20 years making the world worse instead of better, like, that would be really upsetting to me. I would really wonder what the hell I was doing for all that time. And so if we're asking prosecutors to see themselves that way, like, we got to think about how to do that in a way that is not so much about blame. And it's more about, okay, well, we know things now we didn't know 20 years ago. We have a lot more evidence about the criminogenic effect of jail and prison, or all the harm to communities that mass incarceration causes. I think there is a way to talk about responsibility instead of blame, but it's tricky. And this is one way I think that a career prosecutor like Eric Gonzalez actually has an advantage. So I've heard Eric do this with his attorneys. He'll say, like, I did this too. Like, I don't want to look back on my own career and think that I did harm, but I think that I did. That is a differently situated message than someone can bring if they're an outsider and they've never had the job before. I don't know what to do about that. That doesn't mean that, someone like Larry Krasner shouldn't be in office. I just think it means they have to navigate this question of cultural change in a different and very sensitive way.
I have more questions, but I'll ask them unless other people have questions to ask. Yes, Deborah. Yeah.
Well, first of all, let me echo the thanks and point out to the audience that there are opportunities to have a book signed after this event.
Thank you, Deborah.
And
yes.
Give it to your family and friends for Christmas or holidays. But my question is, as you've been hitting the road with it, where have you gotten the most pushback?
So I had this really interesting meeting in Kansas City, Kansas last week. So Kansas City, Kansas, this is a red state, and they elected a DA, first African-American DA in Kansas. Guy used to be a criminal defense attorney, actually has his own criminal record. His name's Mark Dupree, and he brought in his own leadership team. And so I walked into the office, and here are these 4 African Americans, all new, all super friendly and glad for me to be there. Then I walk into all their line attorneys, mostly white line attorneys. There's a total of like 25 people in the room. So this was like a really interesting dynamic and unusual. And I started talking, and I think I kind of made a mistake. I said something made a very blanket statement about plea bargains. And a couple of the younger white men in the room just like went after me, actually accused me of like being dishonest at one point, which seemed a little much. And I felt like this really visceral response to being told that they were exercising their discretion in a harmful way. And like I said, I don't think I had handled it perfectly. And when you say something sort of maximalist, it can be a little hard to figure out what to do. What happened was that Mark, the DA, kind of started pushing back at them, and then we started talking about Brady violations, and that office has a record of wrongful convictions. So these same younger DAs were saying effectively, like, there are constitutional protections for defendants. Why are you worried about prosecutorial accountability? We're not allowed to do those things. Which, I'm sorry, like, that's just not, that's not an answer. Like, I wish that I thought there was real teeth to prosecutorial accountability in this country, but like there isn't. And so then the district attorney really like stepped in, and I ended up kind of receding from the conversation. And I couldn't tell when I left if I'd been helpful, like a catalyst for kind of like a fire that needed to burn, or whether I had just like stirred up the pot in some way that was not actually going to do the office a lot of good when I left. But that was really interesting. And I think that to me it's been surprising I haven't heard more of that. part of it's that the climate is really changing. And it's actually, I think, harder even for traditional prosecutors to kind of know how to make their case in a way that resonates. So a couple years ago, when I wrote a big article for the Times Magazine about prosecutorial accountability, the National DAs Association totally denounced me. The Memphis prosecutor, who's a character in my book, tried to start this hashtag on Twitter, pro-crime NY Times. Seemed like, Trumpian. I thought that was kind of a smart move. Didn't really work, but seemed plausible. And then she went on Fox and she really attacked me rather than the facts in my story. I'm not seeing that this time. And I mean, look, maybe the other shoe will drop tomorrow, but it's interesting as a measure of the politics of the movement, I think.
Rabia?
So thank you very much for this. Two questions. One is that has there been any conversation about restorative justice with progressive prosecutors and the communities of the people that have been incarcerated beforehand in the earlier regime, or is this entirely forward-looking? And the second question is, so far it seems like all the mentions of the police have been that they have been resisting this movement. So are there any examples of the police working in tandem with progressive DAs to sort of instead of against them?
Okay, so I'm going to do the first one, then you may have to remind me of the second one. So there are a couple of examples I can think of that are not merely forward-looking. So the prosecutor in Seattle, Dan Satterberg, has been doing this second look sentencing where he's looking at life sentences that came out of Washington State's 3 strikes laws and asking the governor to commute those sentences or going back to the judges and getting them pulled back. And one thing that's especially noteworthy to me is that he's done 21 of these cases, and one of those folks went out and killed someone after they got out. And when I realized that, I thought, this must be the end of this movement for all the reasons that we were talking about before, like terrible headline, this derails every single reform effort. And I called Satterberg and said, what about this guy? And he said, that was a tragedy. When I look at the overall rate of reoffending of these 21 people, it's much lower than other populations of violent offenders. And I am looking for more of these cases. So that signals a kind of new politics to me. The other example that comes to mind is in Boston, Rachel Rollins, who's this total force of nature, new DA there. She's been meeting with incarcerated people and asking them for feedback on her agenda and really treating them as a kind of focus group. So that's not precisely restorative justice, but it is recognizing them as citizens and as people with something to contribute to this whole endeavor in a way that seems quite special to me. The police. So I'm trying to think if I have any examples of the police. The police are interesting. When you talk about data gathering and transparency, which are so important to this movement, we literally don't know the answers to a lot of questions, and this is something David's written a lot about. The cops are way ahead on this. They have been gathering data, figuring out how to use policing resources more wisely for years. That's what CompStat was about in New York. A lot of big city police departments do that kind of data number crunching now. And so that interest in evidence-based policing makes me think that they could come around on some of these other things. But right now, what we're seeing much more is clashes. In Philadelphia and Boston and Dallas, this sense that there's something being threatened here and that the police are kind of have to protect their way of life, at least from the rank and file police unions. I hope that's going to change, but I don't quite see it yet.
It's worthwhile remembering where George Gascon came from.
That's true.
George Gascon was a career police officer. He was the chief of police in San Francisco. Before that, he was chief of police in Mesa, Arizona. Before that, he was deputy chief in Los Angeles. And I think he has experienced exactly what you're saying, Emily, that he feels that it's kind of the opposite of what you were suggesting, Robbie, that the world of district attorneys is way behind the world of police in terms of reform. Yes?
How do you feel about power shifting away from both prosecutors and defense attorneys and towards algorithms? So, for example, risk assessment algorithms, formulas that determine bail. Is that creating a new problem that we should address, or is that something that can be addressed
You don't want to take that one?
Well, in San Francisco, there have been some factors that we're told not to put into the algorithm that the local judges insist on, and then kind of mess up the whole expectation. And so we've been battling over what it should look like. In the short term, we like it because we fare better than we do with the judges. I mean, we've had some, and we're in San Francisco, but we've had some examples where, there'll be a pre-arraignment discussion in chambers where a judge hearing the preliminary facts of a particular matter will say, I'm going to OR that person, release them on their own recognizance. And then when they step into the courtroom, it's a very large African-American man, and suddenly the judge wants to reconsider this predisposition, and then, the defense attorney calls him a racist, and, it goes from there.
Everything's great from there.
So the algorithm we like it in the short term. I can see long term that there could potentially be some issues. Right now, it's great to kind of teach people that some factors that we've just been fixated on in the past maybe don't really mean that much. And I think the whole system is working towards a place that is relatively new, which is this idea that keeping people in custody, even for a short amount of time, can do a lot of harm, whether it be to family relationships, jobs, housing, et cetera. So, yeah, I don't know. That's why I wanted you to take it.
So I'm very torn about algorithms, maybe because I don't really know enough about them, or we don't have enough evidence yet. So I guess I would say two things. One is that the devil's really in the details. So there are algorithms that just reproduce racial disparity in a truly horrifying way by including arrest records and also zip codes and family ties. And if you're talking about that kind of algorithm, that just seems indefensible. There are better algorithms that seem to be effectively less racist, but I haven't heard of one in which you don't have any kind of racial effect, because whenever you're talking about a criminal justice system that has racial disparity in it, even if you only include the failure to appear rate or the conviction, you're still going to be in some way kind of reifying that racially disparate impact. The counter argument is that, what, you think judges, the story you just told, judges don't, we know from studies that judges also inflict racial disparity on defendants and into the system. So I think sometimes we're having a kind of theoretical conversation in which people who oppose algorithms are saying we don't want to institutionalize this racially disparate effect, even if it's small. And then you kind of have this realist response, which is well, it's already there. It's just hidden, and at least it's transparent. And as Matt was saying, a lot of times the algorithms give judges a reason to let someone out of jail that they might not have without it. It's a really tricky question, though, and really goes into what algorithm, how it's being implemented, and what role it's playing. Is it all about getting people out, released on their own recognizance? Is it sentencing people to longer terms? There are those questions, too.
So there are two people.
If I could just add one thing. In San Francisco, we did have someone released on the algorithm who committed a murder. And after the fact, the only person out there really defending it was George Cascone. So the judges ran from it. Everybody wanted to criticize it. Yeah.
And what did Gascon say? This is one bad result?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
A few years ago, my husband and I were up in Santa Cruz, Long Beach, and there's a man who's now famous named D'Angelo. And I'm a psychiatrist, and I immediately identified him. He had large that you've ever seen. And first I was there alone, and I brought my husband, and we identified him. And so he's a police officer who is a serial killer and a rapist. But instinctively, I've worked with all sorts of people, and I don't think it's a good idea to use language. This man was a multiple rapist and killer and a police officer. So when I called multiple times to the Santa Cruz police and said, there's a bunch of children, I call them children, they were 16, with their bikinis, no bra,
believed in as a ministry. I lived with Crips and Bloods came. My mother was an innocent teacher. And so this language that you're using, racial division, is so disappointing to me. Because I lived it. I had my car stolen and stripped 3 times. And my mother was in 10 miles south of the 10. I don't think many people here who are white would have gone and picked up. I picked up my mother on April 29, 1992. So I'm going to say this is a farce. Because what's been going on, just to let you know, I have multiple family members, one of the federal judge. Multiple people have been DAs. And the cowardice of the people that are in this room to not care about the safety of a child. 20 years ago, I used to call in Livermore when my husband has protected our country. For 9 years, it wasn't a racial thing. It was a red-headed kid driving a white Mercedes. And what I went through, excuse me, is known by a lot of people in this room who should have cared. And I had to do a federal police misconduct lawsuit. And I had to settle it on Armenian Martyrs Day, where a federal judge said it's a privilege to meet me. So I have spoken to people at this institution who don't care that in 2013, we had the #1 sexual assault allegations in this nation. And I actually watched also.
Ma'am, I'm sorry. No, ma'am.
There's a dead child in Livermore. There's a bunch of kids this year. I'm a psychiatrist. Kids are psychotic when they take marijuana. I have called. You have never insisted on letting people know that the DEA met with the National Institute of Mental Health in 2017 before it was legalized. I have called ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox saying multiple doctors have said, here's what's going on. We're giving children drugs which are making them psychotic.
Ma'am, I'm gonna,
Because the language, listen, this man was never caught.
Listen.
Because it's an old boy system. Let me just say that. It's an old boy system between DAs and police. They cover each other's butt. It's been going on.
You can just leave.
And there's a
It's
bunch
not
of
going to help people.
Ma'am, I want to listen to your story. But I want to.
It's not a white person.
No, ma'am, I understand.
No, if the language is.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you guys for coming.